fear is very, very related to aggressive behavior. If we're afraid, the tendency, especially if we're afraid of losing control or being attacked, we will go ahead and get aggressive to protect ourselves from the perceived threat, which means it doesn't have to be a real threat at all. And some people, either because of chemistry or child rearing, tend to be more afraid and therefore try to control. It's what um, bullies tend to do. Um, they don't feel good enough, they feel isolated, they feel resentful, and then they demonize a particular group to gain control. And during times of stress, that tends to grow. So, economic problems, and this we get a little bit into both nurture and nature here. So, if economic problems are happening, if the uh, um, you feel you're losing your place in the world, which I think Americans are feeling greatly at this point, then the tendency is to demonize a particular group and try to get control and get into an us versus them scenario, and then sharing and cooperative behavior tend to go down at that time. The way that we are raised is huge. Um, if you grow up in an us versus them household or city or nation state or group, then what will happen is you will view people from a threat based mindset, an us versus them mindset. And once you've done that, you lose empathy because the other is somehow different than you. They aren't. Uh, we're 99.9% the same. And that includes men and women. I loathe how different men and women are talked about because they are essentially the same. There are some differences, but the way that they're raised is probably the biggest part of the perceived differences that we look at. And the commonality is much more, and that's really where we should be acting. So, what that turns into is a difference between I thou thinking, which is looking at everything around me as similar and as important as I am to myself. And if I see them that way, then I'm going to look at them as non threatening and cooperate. And if I see them as an object, a them against us, whoever us is, then they need to be killed. They're a threat and they need to go down. And during times of gigantic stress, like we have in the world today and in America, we then revert to tribalism and petty nationalism. And the reason that I'm saying petty nationalism is that I'm a historian. That's my other degree, and I taught it for years. And World War I and World War II happened because of petty nationalism. When we divvy groups up and we look at them as the other, eventually they fight. What a concept. So either we're going to, quite frankly, get our heads out of our ass and start looking at each other as fellow human beings that we need to cooperate with, or we're going to get bloody, keep fighting, and go down. That's what happens. And some other civilization on the other side of the planet will take over and they'll go through a golden period and then they'll go down too, until humans really start to realize that we're more common than we are different. So part of that also comes from the idea of scarcity. If I don't have enough, or I think you're going to take it away from me, then I need to get into a win-win thinking and try to beat you, and then things will be okay. Um, Too much competition leads to that. Um, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So the let's go again with the three brains. I've got my logical part, I have my emotional part, I have my reactive part. If I grow up and I have been abused, what happens is it's going to scare me if I'm young. My prefrontal cortex is going to shock out and not be available to me, which leads me to overfeel and to go into what's called a hypnotic trance. Um, so, what will happen in a hypnotic trance is I will remember everything that the abuser did and said, and how they looked, and the circumstances around it, and I'll remember every way that I felt and what I was doing. And I will see myself as a victim, and I'll see them as having power. And then what little kids do is they put their thumb in their mouth, they take their environmental information and they put it into their heads, and then they beat themselves up and victimize themselves. So our self talk is 85% negative and 15% neutral. That's atrocious. And that does not make healthy human beings who are happy. So, what occurs is that there's a civil war going on in my head, and somebody's got to win, but you can't beat yourself enough to win. So, what will happen is the tendency is to either over identify with the victim or over identify with the abuser. Now, in general, what that happens when it's in the extreme is that the person who identified with the abuser is trying to get control and power by essentially becoming an abuser themselves. They will see the world as threatening based on their experience. They will have a tendency to abuse others the way they were abused. They'll make statements like, I was hit and it did me good. And those people in general will become extremely right wing in terms of political inclination. They will be conservative, but to the extreme. The people who have been victimized, if it is extreme, will tend to both loathe and find the abuser as seductive, and they will tend to get into abusive situations over and over subconsciously. They don't want to, they just do. If they do that too much, then you get into the extreme far left, which is bleeding hearts and we need to take care of everyone. Their moderation and no middle tends to occur. There is a third way. I would highly suggest it. Total black, total white is ridiculous. There is a place to conserve things that need conserving. To expect people to be responsible and take care of themselves. To look at the practical side of life. And there makes sense to be open to new ideas, which is what liberal means. and to think outside the box and to change what needs to be changed and to care for people who are hurting. And in saner times, people did both. We're not in the saner times now. We're tribal. We need to pick a side and demonize the other side. Keep doing it and watch what happens because it'll repeat history. Or you could identify with moderation and you could go up and look at both sides and hold two truths at the same time. And that takes a prefrontal cortex and it takes a very developed prefrontal cortex. But if you do that, then you will learn to go ahead and speak moderately, humanely, come up with win win positions, and that will make a whole lot more sense. The tendency will be to appreciate differences, but to see commonality, and intolerance will tend to go down. And there'll be a feeling of the opposite of scarcity, in that there is enough to help out with all. I hope that helps. I'd love to see things become calmer and more rational. Good luck. It'd be weird out there.